For the calculated slaughter of your own family members, you are sentenced to life without parole. You're a danger to everyone around you.
They were just loose ends I had to clean up. Honestly, they should have thanked me for making it quick.
On the morning of April 13, 2023, two bodies were discovered on the Italian marble floor of Colorado's most exclusive mansion, each with a $50,000 watch placed ceremonially on their chest. Thatcher Calderwood Moss, 22, and his younger brother Sutton, 20, had been brutally murdered in their family's Aspen estate, the blood pooling beneath them as spring sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows. One brother had been destined for Harvard Law. The other was training for the Olympics. But someone had decided the Calderwood Moss dynasty needed one less heir, and they'd carried out that decision with chilling, calculated precision, leaving behind expensive timepieces like coins for the dead. The 911 call had come at 7:23 a.m. from the estate's head of security, his voice cracking as he reported what he'd found during his morning rounds. Detective Isabella Watson arrived within 20 minutes, her unmarked vehicle crunching up the gravel drive past the estate's iron gates. The mansion's smart home system was still running, its screens glowing with data about temperature, humidity, and energy consumption, treating the death scene like just another day of automated luxury. Isabella noticed immediately that despite the spring warmth outside, the interior temperature read 58 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to preserve the crime scene, but warm enough not to trigger any emergency alerts. Before we go further into this story, I want to ask you to do something. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Now, let's get back to what Detective Watson found in that frozen mansion. The murder weapon lay shattered beside Thatcher's body, a 1920s antique lacrosse stick with sterling silver inlay, its wooden shaft splintered from the force of repeated blows. Blood spatter analysis would later show that both brothers had been attacked in a frenzy, struck multiple times even after they'd fallen. Yet despite the violence, the scene had an eerie orderliness to it, the watches positioned with care, no signs of ransacking or theft, the brothers' phones and wallets untouched on the nearby credenza. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a home invasion by desperate criminals looking for quick cash to fuel an addiction. The pharmaceutical fortune that had built this mansion had also built enemies, and Isabella Watson knew that murders among the ultra-wealthy rarely involved strangers. The Calderwood Moss family's biotech empire had made billions from pain medication, antidepressants, and most recently, a controversial new line of synthetic opioids marketed for breakthrough pain management. Whitmore Calderwood Moss, the patriarch, had been investigated twice by federal regulators but never charged, his legal team as expensive and effective as the medications his company produced. His wife Genevieve came from old money herself, her family's mining fortune dating back to the Colorado Silver Rush of the 1880s. The estate's security system showed no forced entry, no unauthorized access in the 24 hours before the murders. The front gate logs recorded only family members, staff, and one delivery from a high-end wine merchant at 3:47 p.m. on April 12th. The interior cameras had mysteriously stopped recording at 11:56 p.m. that same night, their feeds going dark in what the system logged as a scheduled maintenance update. But Isabella's forensic tech specialist, brought in from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, noticed something the killer hadn't anticipated. The geothermal climate control system kept its own separate logs, independent of the main security network. Those logs told a story that would crack the case wide open. At 7:09 a.m. on April 13th, someone had remotely accessed the system and dropped the temperature to 58 degrees, the exact setting the mansion used for extended vacations when the family wanted to preserve the interior without fully shutting down. The system required biometric authentication or a unique access code known only to three people: Thatcher, Sutton, and Hollis Kensington Sullivan. Hollis was the daughter of Sterling Kensington Sullivan, a private equity magnate whose firm had partnered with Calderwood Moss Pharmaceuticals on several ventures, and Caledonia Kensington Sullivan, an art dealer who moved in the same rarefied social circles as Genevieve. The families had been close for years, their children growing up together at the same exclusive private schools, the same yacht clubs, the same charity galas where a plate at dinner cost more than most Americans earned in a month. Hollis, now 17, had been given access to the mansion systems the previous summer when she'd house-sat during the Calderwood Moss family's trip to their villa in Provence. She'd been trusted, treated almost like a daughter by Whitmore and Genevieve, welcomed into their inner circle with the casual generosity of people who'd never had to question anyone's motives. That trust, Detective Watson was beginning to suspect, had been catastrophically misplaced. The forensic team worked methodically through the crime scene, photographing every blood drop, every fiber, every fingerprint. They found defensive wounds on both victims' hands and forearms, indicating they'd tried to fight back against their attacker. Thatcher had been struck first, the medical examiner would later determine, ambushed from behind as he stood near the fireplace, his skull fractured by the initial blow. Sutton had made it halfway across the room, blood trail showing he'd tried to reach the panic button installed near the main entrance, but he'd been caught and beaten to death just feet from potential salvation. What the forensic team found on the shattered lacrosse stick would prove even more damning than the access logs. Mixed with the victim's blood were skin cells containing DNA that didn't match either brother, cells that showed markers for an extremely rare genetic condition. Haley disease affects only 1 in 50,000 people, causing chronic skin blistering and lesions that flare up under stress. The condition was so distinctive that a simple database search of dermatology records in the Aspen area would likely identify the killer, assuming they'd ever sought treatment. The antique lacrosse stick itself was a piece of family history, a relic from Whitmore Calderwood Moss's grandfather's days at Yale. It had been displayed in the mansion's trophy room for decades, mounted on the wall alongside rowing medals, polo trophies, and photographs of 5 generations of athletic achievements. But 6 weeks before the murders, the stick had been removed for restoration, checked out by someone who'd signed the work order at Aspen's premier antiques conservator. The signature on that order read, Hollis Kensington Sullivan, and in the notes section, she'd written that she was having it restored as a surprise gift for her brothers. Isabella Watson stood in the great room as the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, illuminating the chalk outlines where Thatcher and Sutton had fallen. The pieces were assembling themselves into a picture of calculated murder, of betrayal, wrapped in privilege, and presented with expensive watches like a perverted parting gift. But what could drive a 17-year-old girl from one of Aspen's wealthiest families to murder 2 young men she'd known her entire life? The detective had seen plenty of murders motivated by money, by jealousy, by rage, but this felt different, more complex, layers of motive waiting to be uncovered. The Patek Philippe watches bothered her most of all. Each one was worth enough to buy a luxury car, the kind of timepiece that got passed down through generations as a symbol of enduring wealth and status. Placing them on the bodies wasn't an accident or an afterthought, it was a message, though to whom and saying what remained unclear. Were they meant as mockery, a final insult to young men who'd been born into privilege and died because of it? Or were they some twisted form of respect, a killer's way of acknowledging the value of what she'd destroyed? Detective Isabella Watson's investigation kicked into high gear within hours of discovering the smart home data anomaly. She assembled a task force that included digital forensic specialists from the FBI's Cyber Crimes Division, knowing that the geothermal system logs might be challenged in court if they weren't handled with absolute technical precision. The logs showed not just the temperature change at 7:09 a.m. on April 13th, but a pattern of access that painted a disturbing picture of premeditation. Someone had logged into the system 6 times in the week before the murders, always late at night, always from a remote location, testing the controls and reviewing the mansion's automated responses. The digital forensics team, led by Special Agent Marcus Chen from the FBI's Denver field office, pulled the complete access history from the smart home's cloud backup. Every login was time-stamped and geolocated through IP address tracking, and every single unauthorized access point traced back to the same location, the Kensington Sullivan compound, a 40-acre estate in the Roaring Fork Valley just 15 miles from the Calderwood Moss mansion. The login credentials used were Hollis's personal authentication codes, issued to her the previous July when she'd been entrusted with house-sitting responsibilities. But what made the data truly incriminating was the pattern of access in the 48 hours immediately before the murders. On April 11th at 11:47 p.m., someone using Hollis's credentials had accessed the mansion's security camera system and initiated a firmware update that would disable recording for exactly 8 hours. The system's manufacturer confirmed that no such update had been scheduled or authorized by their company, meaning it was custom code uploaded by someone with sophisticated technical knowledge. On April 12th at 2:33 a.m., the same credentials were used to review the mansion's staff schedule, confirming that the live-in housekeeper had the week off and the estate would be empty, except for the brothers. At 6:15 p.m. on April 12th, another login reviewed the geothermal system's preservation settings, essentially rehearsing the exact command that would be executed 13 hours later. Isabella Watson sat in her temporary command post at the Pitkin County Sheriff's Office, reviewing the timeline with her team. The prosecution would later argue that these logs showed a level of planning incompatible with any claim of impulsive violence or temporary insanity. Every action demonstrated knowledge of the mansion systems, awareness of the staff schedule, and deliberate steps to eliminate evidence while preserving the crime scene for maximum forensic value. The 50-trip dive to temperature setting was particularly clever, cold enough to slow decomposition and preserve blood spatter patterns, but not so cold as to trigger the system's freeze protection alerts that would have notified the property management company. But the smart home data revealed something even more chilling when cross-referenced with other evidence. The mansion's geothermal system was integrated with a whole house air quality monitoring system, which tracked not just temperature and humidity, but also detected unusual chemical signatures that might indicate fire, gas leaks, or other hazards. On the night of April 12th, starting at 11:15 p.m., the system had detected trace amounts of a pharmaceutical compound in the air, specifically a benzodiazepine aerosol that matched the chemical signature of Rohypnol. The levels were low, consistent with a dispersal spray rather than any kind of industrial accident, concentrated in the great room and the upstairs hallway leading to the brothers' bedrooms. The implication was staggering. Hollis hadn't just planned to murder Thatcher and Sutton, she'd attempted to drug them first, likely spraying an aerosolized sedative through the mansion's ventilation system to make them sluggish and defenseless. The plan had apparently only partially worked, as the defensive wounds on both victims showed they'd been conscious and fighting for their lives. But the attempt revealed a level of premeditation that transformed this from a crime of passion into something far more calculated, almost clinical, in its execution. Detective Watson obtained search warrants for both the Kensington Sullivan compound and Hollis's personal vehicle, a custom Mercedes-Benz G-Class that had been a gift for her 16th birthday. The search of the estate would come later, but the vehicle search happened immediately, conducted in the impound lot, where the SUV had been towed after being spotted leaving a private airfield at 9:30 a.m. on April 13th. Inside the vehicle's locked glove compartment, investigators found a burner phone containing encrypted messages that, once cracked by the FBI's cryptography unit, revealed communications with a dark web pharmaceutical supplier. The messages detailed orders for various controlled substances, including fentanyl analogs, veterinary-grade sedatives, and industrial quantities of prescription pills that had been reported stolen from Calderwood Moss Pharmaceuticals distribution centers over the past 18 months. The operation was massive, pulling in what the messages suggested was approximately $400,000 per week through a network of dealers operating at elite prep schools across Colorado, California, and the Northeast. Hollis had been running a prescription drug empire, using her family connections and her access to the Calderwood Moss pharmaceutical infrastructure to build what federal prosecutors would later describe as the most sophisticated teenage drug trafficking operation in American history. But the messages revealed something even more explosive. In an encrypted chat from March 15, 2023, exactly 28 days before the murders, Hollis had written to an unknown contact, "The brothers know. T found the trust disbursements. S traced the shipments. They're threatening to tell Whitmore everything unless I stop. But they don't know the real secret, the one that makes me untouchable. I'm not their sister by marriage, I'm their sister by blood. Whitmore is my real father. Caledonia finally told me the truth after I did the DNA test. I'm the only daughter, which means I inherit more than both of them combined. They're threatening to challenge my paternity claim legally to expose my mother's affair and destroy both families. I can't let that happen. I won't let that happen." Isabella Watson read the message 3 times, feeling the case transform before her eyes. This wasn't just about covering up a drug operation or protecting a fortune. It was about identity, legitimacy, and the kind of inheritance dispute that had driven violence throughout human history. Hollis had discovered she was the biological daughter of Whitmore Calderwood Moss, making her the only female child and, under the terms of the family trust, entitled to a larger share of the pharmaceutical empire than either of her half-brothers. But Thatcher and Sutton had learned about both the drug operation and the paternity claim, and they'd threatened to expose everything. The detective immediately requested a warrant for Hollis's medical records, specifically any DNA testing she might have undergone. The records from a boutique genetics testing service in Aspen showed that on February 1, 2023, Hollis had submitted samples for a comprehensive ancestry and paternity analysis. The results, delivered on February 14th, confirmed with 99.97% certainty that Whitmore Calderwood Moss was her biological father. The testing company's notes indicated she'd also submitted samples she claimed were from her mother for comparison purposes, which turned out to be accurate matches for Caledonia Kensington Sullivan. Armed with this information, Isabella Watson interviewed Whitmore and Genevieve Calderwood Moss at their temporary residence in Aspen's Hotel Jerome, where they'd been staying since the murders made their mansion an active crime scene. Whitmore, 58, looked like he'd aged a decade in the 4 days since his son's deaths, his face drawn and gray, despite what must have been considerable pharmaceutical assistance. Genevieve, 54, sat rigid in her chair, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. When Isabella asked about Hollis's paternity, Whitmore's face went from gray to white, and Genevieve made a sound like she'd been punched in the stomach. "I don't know what you're talking about," Whitmore said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Caledonia and I are friends, business associates. Sterling and I have known each other for 30 years. This is absurd." But Genevieve stood up abruptly, knocking her chair backward, and walked to the window overlooking Aspen's downtown core. "How long," she asked, not turning around, "how long did you think you could hide it, Whitmore?" The detective watched as decades of marriage crumbled in real time, the pharmaceutical magnate's face confirming what his words denied. The revelation added a new dimension to the prosecution's theory of motive. Hollis hadn't just been protecting her drug operation, she'd been fighting for her place in a dynasty, for recognition as Whitmore Calderwood Moss's biological heir. The brothers had represented a dual threat. They could expose her criminal enterprise and challenge her paternity claim in court, potentially stripping her of her inheritance and destroying the fantasy of belonging to the Calderwood Moss family that she'd apparently constructed. The $50,000 Patek Philippe watches suddenly made sense as a symbol, a statement about inheritance and who deserved to possess the family's wealth. Detective Watson knew she had enough for an arrest warrant, but she wanted one more piece of evidence, the physical proof that would eliminate any possibility of reasonable doubt. The antique lacrosse stick had already provided DNA evidence linking Hollis to the crime scene through her rare skin condition, but the detective wanted to trace the weapon's journey from the conservation shop to the murder scene. She interviewed the owner of Aspen Antiques Conservation, a specialist named Gerald Hoffman who'd been restoring pieces for wealthy families for 40 years. His records showed that Hollis had picked up the restored lacrosse stick on April 10, 2023, just 2 days before the murders, signing for it personally and paying the $8,500 restoration fee with a credit card in her mother's name. Did she say what she planned to do with it? Isabella asked. Gerald nodded, pulling up his detailed notes on the transaction. She said it was going to be a gift for her brothers, that she wanted to surprise them with a piece of their family history restored to its original glory. She seemed excited about it, genuinely happy. He paused, his elderly face troubled. I remember thinking it was nice to see young people caring about family heritage. She even asked me to wrap it in archival tissue paper so it wouldn't get damaged before she gave it to them. I had no idea she was planning to use it for what she did. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when the forensic team located the Weimaraner, the Calderwood Moss family's dog, locked in a guest wing of the mansion, with food and water that had been set out deliberately. The dog's microchip contained GPS tracking data, showing it had been moved from its usual sleeping area in the great room to the locked guest wing at 11:03 p.m. on April 12th, approximately 8 hours before the murders. Someone had wanted the dog safely contained and cared for, unable to interfere or raise an alarm during the attack. That level of consideration for the family pet, combined with the brutal murder of 2 human beings, suggested a psychology that could compartmentalize violence in disturbing ways. The forensic analysis of the shattered antique lacrosse stick became the cornerstone of the physical evidence against Hollis Kensington Sullivan. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation's lead DNA analyst, worked around the clock to process the biological material recovered from the weapon. The stick's sterling silver inlay had preserved cellular material in its decorative grooves, protected from contamination by the metal's antimicrobial properties. Under high magnification microscopy, Dr. Martinez identified skin cells exhibiting the distinctive pathology of Haley-Haley disease, a genetic disorder so rare that finding another person with the condition in Aspen would be statistically improbable to the point of impossibility. The DNA extracted from these cells underwent full genetic sequencing at the FBI's laboratory in Quantico, Virginia. The results came back with markers that were an exact match to samples from Hollis's medical records at Summit Dermatology, an elite skin treatment clinic in Aspen, where she'd been receiving specialized care for her condition since age 14. The clinic's records showed regular visits for treatment of the chronic blistering and skin breakdown characteristic of Haley-Haley disease, with photographs documenting the severity of her outbreaks during periods of stress. The most recent visit had been on March 20th, 2023, just 3 weeks before the murders, when she'd complained of increased lesions on her hands and forearms. Dr. Martinez's testimony would be crucial, and Detective Watson made sure every aspect of the DNA evidence was documented with redundant verification. The chain of custody for every sample was photographed and logged, with 3 independent witnesses present during each transfer. The DNA analysis wasn't just run once, but 3 separate times using different methodologies, each producing identical results. The statistical probability of the DNA belonging to someone other than Hollis was calculated at less than 1 in 47 trillion, a number that would be impossible for any jury to dismiss as coincidence. But the DNA was only part of the lacrosse stick story. The restoration work order from Aspen Antiques Conservation provided a direct link between Hollis and the weapon, her signature in elegant script at the bottom of the form. Gerald Hoffman's detailed notes describe the restoration process, including the cleaning of the sterling silver inlay and the reinforcement of the wooden shaft with a specialized epoxy that happened to contain trace elements of titanium dioxide. When the forensic team analyzed wood fragments from the crime scene, they found those same titanium dioxide signatures, confirming that the murder weapon was indeed the same stick Hollis had claimed to be restoring as a gift. The work order itself became a critical piece of evidence for establishing premeditation. In her own handwriting, Hollis had specified that the stick should be restored to full functional integrity, not just cosmetic appearance. She'd requested that the shaft be reinforced to handle actual use rather than just display, paying an extra $2,000 for structural work that Gerald Hoffman had initially questioned as unnecessary for what she'd claimed was a decorative gift. In hindsight, those specifications read like a blueprint for creating a weapon capable of inflicting fatal injuries. The delicate antique transformed into something that could cave in a human skull. Detective Watson traveled to Summit Dermatology with a warrant for Hollis's complete medical file. Dr. Patricia Kim, the dermatologist who'd treated Hollis for 3 years, was visibly shaken when she learned her patient was the prime suspect in a double murder. The medical records showed that Hollis's Haley disease was particularly severe, with flare-ups triggered by emotional stress that caused painful blistering across her hands, wrists, and forearms. The photographs in her file showed exactly the kind of cellular damage that would transfer DNA to any surface she touched, especially during a period of physical exertion, like beating 2 men to death with a lacrosse stick. The condition is genetic, Dr. Kim explained, her voice carefully professional despite her obvious distress. It's caused by a mutation in the ATP2C1 gene, passed down in an autosomal dominant pattern. Hollis inherited it from her mother, Caledonia. I've actually treated both of them, though obviously I can't discuss Caledonia's records without a separate warrant. Isabella Watson made a note to obtain that warrant immediately, sensing another piece of the genetic puzzle falling into place. If Caledonia had the same rare condition and had passed it to her daughter, it would be additional confirmation of their biological relationship, separate from any paternity testing regarding Whitmore Calderwood Moss. The forensic team's reconstruction of the crime scene, using blood spatter analysis and the position of the bodies, told a brutal story. Thatcher had been struck first, hit from behind as he stood near the stone fireplace in the great room. The angle of the blow suggested an attacker approximately 5 feet 7 inches tall, consistent with Hollis's height of 5 feet 8 inches. The force of the impact had driven fragments of the lacrosse stick's wooden shaft into Thatcher's skull, wood splinters that still contained traces of both his blood and the killer's DNA from the Haley skin cells. Sutton had died harder, fighting for his life across 20 feet of marble floor. The blood trail showed he'd been struck initially near the entrance to the great room, then had staggered toward the front door where the panic button was located. He'd made it within 6 feet of potential salvation before being caught and beaten to death, his final position indicating he'd fallen face first and been struck repeatedly from above. The medical examiner counted 17 distinct impact wounds on his body, some delivered after he was already dead. the killer continuing to swing the lacrosse stick in what could only be described as a frenzy. What made the DNA evidence even more damning was where it was found. The skin cells weren't just on the striking surface of the lacrosse stick, where they might have been explained away as transfer from casual handling. They were embedded in the blood and tissue adhering to the weapon, mixed with the victim's biological material in a way that could only have occurred during the violent act itself. Dr. Martinez's analysis showed that the cellular material had been deposited under conditions of mechanical stress and moisture, consistent with sweating hands gripping the weapon during repeated impacts. There was no innocent explanation for that pattern. Detective Watson requested a full medical examination of Hollis's hands and arms, which would require her to submit to questioning and surrender samples. The detective knew that approaching the Kensington Sullivan compound to make contact with the suspect would be a delicate operation. Sterling Kensington Sullivan had already retained Thomas Waverly, one of Colorado's most expensive and aggressive criminal defense attorneys, a man who had built his reputation on destroying prosecution cases before they ever reached trial. Waverly had sent a formal letter to the sheriff's office stating that his client would not be answering any questions and instructing all law enforcement to cease any contact unless they had an arrest warrant. But Isabella Watson had something better than an arrest warrant. She had a plan to catch Hollis in the act of revealing her own guilt, to approach her before the walls of lawyers and legal procedure could slam shut. The detective had learned from the digital forensics team that Hollis had been tracking news coverage of the murders obsessively, logging into news websites dozens of times per day from her phone and laptop. She was following her own story like a spectator at a sporting event, unable to resist watching the investigation unfold. That compulsion, that need to witness the impact of her actions, would be her downfall. On April 17, 2023, exactly 5 days after the murders, Detective Watson and a team of investigators approached the Kensington Sullivan compound. The estate was even more opulent than the Calderwood Moss mansion, 40 acres of manicured grounds surrounding a main house that looked like a European castle had been airlifted to the Colorado mountains. The security gate was open for a landscape service truck, and the investigators drove through before anyone could stop them. They found Hollis exactly where Isabella had suspected she'd be, in the estate's solarium, having a $500 gel manicure while watching CNBC's live coverage of the investigation on a 90-inch television screen. She looked up when the detectives entered, her expression showing no fear, no surprise, just a kind of cool assessment. She was beautiful in the way that extreme wealth often produces, her features refined by generations of genetic selection and enhanced by access to the best cosmetic dermatology money could buy. Despite the Haley disease, her skin appeared flawless, the result of expensive treatments and careful makeup. Her nails were being painted a deep burgundy color that matched the Patek Philippe watches she'd left on her victims. "Is this about the fentanyl or my brothers?" she asked, her voice utterly calm, as if she were asking whether the detectives preferred coffee or tea. The manicurist, a young woman who looked terrified to suddenly be in the middle of a police investigation, pulled her hands back and stood up quickly. Isabella Watson nodded to one of her colleagues, who escorted the woman out of the room. Then the detective sat down across from Hollis, maintaining eye contact with this teenager who'd just casually admitted to knowing about both a major drug operation and a double murder. "We'd like to talk to you about both," Isabella said carefully. "But first, I need to advise you of your rights." Before she could begin the Miranda warning, Thomas Waverly burst into the solarium, followed by Sterling and Caledonia Kensington Sullivan. The lawyer was furious, already shouting about illegal entry and harassment of a minor. But Isabella had her footage, her recording of Hollis's first reaction, that casual question that implied knowledge no innocent person would possess. Is this about the fentanyl or my brothers? The words would be played in court repeatedly, analyzed by expert witnesses, presented as consciousness of guilt in its purest form. Hollis Kensington Sullivan had just confessed to knowing about both major components of the investigation before any detective had mentioned either one. The confrontation at the Kensington Sullivan compound lasted less than 10 minutes before Thomas Waverly succeeded in ejecting the investigators from the property. But those 10 minutes gave Detective Isabella Watson everything she needed to escalate the investigation into a full-blown arrest operation. Hollis's statement, captured on body camera footage from 3 different angles, would become the prosecution's opening exhibit, the first glimpse a jury would get of the defendant's consciousness of guilt. Is this about the fentanyl or my brothers? Those 8 words contained admissions to knowledge about both a massive drug trafficking operation and her relationship to murder victims, spoken before anyone had asked her a single question. Thomas Waverly immediately filed a motion to suppress the statement, arguing that his client had been under duress, ambushed in her own home, and questioned without proper legal counsel despite being a minor. But Colorado law was clear. Police didn't need parental permission or a lawyer present to ask preliminary questions during an investigation. And Hollis had volunteered her statement before any interrogation began. The prosecution would argue that her words were spontaneous utterances, excited utterances made in the heat of the moment, exempt from the usual restrictions on custodial interrogation. Judge Raymond Martinez, assigned to the case, would ultimately rule the statement admissible, dealing the defense its first major blow. Within 24 hours of the solarium encounter, Detective Watson had assembled enough evidence to request formal arrest warrants for Hollis Kensington Sullivan on 2 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of drug trafficking, and embezzlement from the Calderwood Moss Pharmaceutical Trust. The warrant application ran to 87 pages, documenting the smart home data, the DNA evidence from the murder weapon, the encrypted messages about the drug operation, and the paternity testing that established motive. District Attorney Violet Torres, 43, took personal charge of the case, recognizing it as potentially the most high-profile prosecution of her career. Violet Torres was known for her methodical approach to building cases, her ability to present complex evidence in ways that juries could understand and believe. She'd grown up in Commerce City, the daughter of immigrants from El Salvador, and had worked her way through law school while raising 2 children as a single mother. Her appointment as district attorney had been controversial among Aspen's elite, many of whom preferred prosecutors who understood the nuances of cases involving wealthy defendants. But Violet had proven herself ruthless in her commitment to equal justice, and she viewed the Kensington Sullivan case as an opportunity to demonstrate that nobody was above the law, regardless of how many millions their family had in the bank. The arrest took place on April 19, 2023, at 6 a.m., deliberately timed to catch the family before their legal team could mobilize. A convoy of law enforcement vehicles approached the Kensington Sullivan compound with a signed warrant, backed up by members of the FBI's Violent Crimes Task Force. Sterling Kensington Sullivan answered the door in a silk robe, his face going from indignant to terrified as Detective Watson explained they were there to arrest his daughter. Caledonia appeared at the top of the curved staircase, her hands pressed against the railing, her face pale. Hollis came down the stairs 10 minutes later, dressed in designer jeans and a cashmere sweater, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, looking like she was heading to a college campus tour rather than jail. She'd had time to compose herself, time to put on the mask of calm superiority that would characterize her demeanor throughout the legal proceedings. She extended her wrists for the handcuffs without protest, without tears, without any visible emotional response at all. "May I bring my phone?" she asked Detective Watson. "I'll need to update my social media followers that I'll be unavailable for a while." The booking process at the Pitkin County Jail revealed the extent of Hollis's planning, even in the moment of her arrest. Her phone, seized as evidence, contained draft social media posts pre-written for this exact scenario, carefully crafted messages positioning herself as a victim of persecution, a young woman targeted for her family's wealth and success. She'd even prepared multiple versions, one claiming complete innocence, another admitting to the drug operation but denying the murders, and a third suggesting she'd been framed by business rivals of her father's. The existence of these pre-written statements would later be used by prosecutors as evidence of her calculating nature, her ability to plan for contingencies, and manipulate public perception. The initial court appearance happened within 48 hours of her arrest, Hollis appearing via video link from the county jail wearing an orange jumpsuit that somehow made her look even younger than 17. Thomas Waverly immediately moved for bail, arguing that his client posed no flight risk given her family's deep roots in the community and had no prior criminal record. He presented letters from 15 prominent Aspen residents, including business leaders, philanthropists, and even a retired Colorado Supreme Court justice, all vouching for Hollis's character and urging the court to release her to her parents' custody pending trial. Prosecutor Violet Torres stood up and methodically demolished the bail request in a presentation that lasted 40 minutes. She detailed the evidence of premeditation, the encrypted messages showing Hollis had discussed fleeing to non-extradition countries if her drug operation was ever discovered. She presented financial records showing Hollis had moved $8 million to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands in the 3 weeks before the murders, money that could easily fund a lifetime on the run. She showed the court photographs of Thatcher and Sutton Calderwood Moss, their broken bodies, the savage injuries that spoke to a capacity for violence inconsistent with any notion of community safety. "This defendant is not a troubled teenager who made a mistake," Violet Torres told the court, her voice sharp with controlled anger. "She is a calculating killer who murdered 2 people to protect a criminal enterprise and secure an inheritance she believed was rightfully hers. She is a flight risk with access to millions of dollars and documented plans to flee if necessary. She is a danger to the community, having demonstrated a willingness to kill anyone who threatens her interests. Bail should be denied, and she should remain in custody until trial." Judge Martinez agreed, denying bail and ordering Hollis held without bond in a juvenile detention facility pending the question of whether she would be tried as an adult. That question became the next battleground, with the prosecution filing for a transfer hearing under Colorado's Corinthian Protocol. This rare 2022 law, named after a case involving a teenage heir who'd murdered his parents for inheritance, allowed prosecutors to request adult court jurisdiction for wealthy juvenile defendants whose access to resources made them fundamentally different from typical juvenile offenders. The law was controversial, criticized as class-based prosecution, but it had survived multiple constitutional challenges. The transfer hearing consumed 3 days of testimony in May 2023, with expert witnesses debating whether Hollis's wealth and sophistication made her more culpable than a typical 17-year-old defendant. Dr. Elizabeth Hartman, a forensic psychologist retained by the defense, testified that Hollis suffered from a dependent personality disorder exacerbated by her parents' emotionally distant parenting style, making her vulnerable to poor decision-making under stress. Dr. Richard Chen, the prosecution's psychological expert, testified that Hollis exhibited traits of narcissistic personality disorder with sociopathic features, showing no genuine empathy or remorse for her victims. The prosecution's most effective witness was a forensic accountant who traced Hollis's financial transactions over the previous 18 months. Christine Volkov, a former IRS investigator, demonstrated how Hollis had systematically embezzled funds from the Calderwood Moss Pharmaceutical Trust, using sophisticated money laundering techniques typically seen in organized crime. She'd created shell companies, falsified invoices, and manipulated digital records with a level of skill that required either significant training or assistance from professionals. This is not a child making impulsive choices, Volkov testified. This is a criminal mastermind operating a multi-million-dollar enterprise with the sophistication of someone twice her age. Judge Martinez issued his ruling on May 25, 2023, finding that Hollis met the criteria for adult prosecution under the Corinthian Protocol. His written opinion noted that the defendant's privileged background, access to expert legal and financial advice, and demonstrated capacity for complex planning and criminal sophistication render her fundamentally different from the typical juvenile offender. Her wealth has afforded her opportunities and education that make her criminally culpable to the same degree as an adult defendant, if not more so given the advantages she's enjoyed. This court finds that justice requires she be held to adult standards of accountability. The ruling meant Hollis would be transferred to Adult County Jail to await trial, a significant victory for the prosecution. Adult court meant harsher potential sentences, different rules of evidence, and a jury pool less likely to be swayed by sympathy for a teenage defendant. Thomas Waverly immediately appealed the decision to the Colorado Court of Appeals, but the higher court declined to intervene, letting Judge Martinez's ruling stand. Hollis Kensington Sullivan, 17 years old, would be tried as an adult for 2 counts of first-degree murder. The case began to attract national media attention, the perfect storm of wealth, privilege, murder, and family secrets that cable news networks love to dissect endlessly. Court TV announced it would broadcast the trial live in its entirety. A documentary crew from Netflix requested access to both the prosecution and defense teams. Hollis's social media accounts, frozen by court order, still had hundreds of thousands of followers who debated her guilt in comment sections and created tribute pages and hate pages in equal measure. Through all of this, Hollis herself remained eerily composed, showing no visible emotional response to the proceedings that would determine whether she spent the rest of her life in prison. Jail staff reported that she kept to herself, reading fashion magazines and economics textbooks, maintaining the same careful appearance and controlled demeanor she'd displayed during her arrest. The only time anyone saw her cry was during a jailhouse visit from her mother, Caledonia, but even those tears were controlled, delicate, more theatrical than genuinely emotional. She was performing even in her grief, playing a role, maintaining an image. Detective Isabella Watson, watching from the gallery during the transfer hearing, felt a chill run down her spine as she studied Hollis's face. She'd investigated dozens of murders in her 18 years in law enforcement, but she'd never encountered a teenager with this level of calculated coldness, this complete absence of normal human remorse. Hollis Kensington Sullivan was a predator in designer clothes, a killer who'd been raised in a world where everything could be bought, including escape from consequences. But this time, Watson was determined the consequences were going to catch up with her. The trial of Colorado versus Kensington Sullivan began on September 11, 2023, in a specially secured courtroom at the Pitkin County Justice Center. Security was unprecedented for an Aspen trial, with metal detectors, bag searches, and a prohibition on any electronic devices for anyone except credentialed media. Judge Raymond Martinez had received multiple death threats from both sides. People who believed Hollis was a monster who deserved execution, and people who believed she was being railroaded because of class resentment. The jury selection had taken 2 weeks, with prosecutor Violet Torres and defense attorney Thomas Waverly, each using their challenges to craft a panel they believed would be receptive to their respective theories. The final jury consisted of 8 women and 4 men, ranging in age from 26 to 67, with backgrounds that included a retired teacher, a small business owner, an accountant, a nurse, a construction foreman, and a software engineer. The prosecution had fought to keep wealthy jurors off the panel, believing they'd be too sympathetic to Hollis's privileged background. The defense had fought to exclude anyone with connections to law enforcement or the pharmaceutical industry. The result was a jury that Prosecutor Torres believed it would be unmoved by displays of wealth, and defense attorney Waverly believed would be skeptical of the prosecution's complex technical evidence. Opening arguments began at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, with Prosecutor Violet Torres standing before the jury in a navy blue suit, her presentation materials already loaded on the courtroom's video screens. She began not with the murders themselves, but with the smart home system, the technological evidence that would become the foundation of her case. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are going to show you something unprecedented in the history of Colorado criminal justice. We are going to show you a house that testified against its owner's killer. We are going to show you how the Calderwood Moss Mansion's own geothermal system recorded the defendant's preparation for murder, her deliberate steps to preserve the crime scene, and her cold-blooded execution of two young men whose only mistake was discovering her secrets. The courtroom's video screens lit up with a three-dimensional rendering of the mansion created by the prosecution's forensic animation team. Torres walked the jury through the smart home's architecture, explaining how the geothermal system operated independently of the main security network, how it kept logs that couldn't be deleted or altered without leaving digital fingerprints. She showed them the temperature adjustment at 7:09 a.m. on April 13th, the exact setting designed to preserve the crime scene without triggering any automated alerts. The defendant thought she'd covered her tracks by disabling the security cameras, Torres explained, her voice precise and measured. But she didn't know that the house itself was keeping records, creating a timeline that proves premeditation beyond any possible doubt. She moved through the evidence methodically, each piece building on the last like blocks in a prosecutor's tower. The DNA from the murder weapon, with its genetic markers for Haley disease that matched only one person in the entire Aspen area. The restoration work order that Hollis had signed requesting the antique lacrosse stick be reinforced for actual use rather than mere display. The encrypted messages detailing a $400,000 per week drug operation and threats from the victims to expose both the operation and Hollis's paternity claim. The $50,000 Patek Philippe watches left on each body, a symbolic message about inheritance and who deserved to possess the family wealth. Torres saved her most powerful evidence for last, playing the body camera footage from the Kensington Sullivan Solarium on the courtroom's screens. The jury watched Hollis, perfectly composed while receiving a manicure, ask Detective Watson, "Is this about the fentanyl or my brothers?" The prosecutor let the question hang in the air, replaying it once more before turning to the jury. Those 8 words tell you everything you need to know about this defendant. She wasn't asking, "What happened to my brothers?" or "Are they okay?" She was asking which crime the police had discovered. She spoke like a criminal caught in the act, not like a family friend devastated by tragedy, because she wasn't devastated. She was the one who created the tragedy. The prosecution's opening statement lasted 90 minutes, taking the jury through a comprehensive narrative of murder for inheritance, of a teenage killer so consumed by greed and entitlement that she'd bludgeoned 2 young men to death to protect her place in a dynasty. Violet Torres concluded by promising to prove every element beyond reasonable doubt, to show the jury that justice demanded a verdict of guilty on all charges. Thatcher and Sutton Calderwood Moss should be alive today, she finished, her voice thick with controlled emotion. They should be building their careers, building their families, building the future they'd worked so hard to create. Instead, they're dead, murdered by someone they trusted, someone they'd known their entire lives. We ask you to give them the only justice they can still receive, hold their killer accountable. Thomas Waverly's opening statement could not have been more different in tone and strategy. He approached the jury with a sympathetic expression, positioning himself as the defender of a deeply troubled young woman who'd been failed by every adult in her life. "The prosecution wants you to see a monster," he began. "They want you to believe that a 17-year-old girl, a child who should be thinking about college applications and prom dresses, instead spent her nights planning a double murder with the sophistication of a career criminal. But that's not what the evidence really shows. What the evidence shows is a vulnerable teenager trapped in a web of lies created by the adults around her, manipulated and used, and ultimately abandoned when those lies threatened to unravel." Waverly admitted immediately that Hollis had been involved in illegal drug distribution, a calculated decision to concede the indefensible and focus jury attention elsewhere. "My client made mistakes," he acknowledged, "serious mistakes that she deeply regrets and for which she's prepared to accept responsibility. She was recruited into a drug operation by older criminals who took advantage of her family connections and her desperate desire to feel valued and important. That was wrong. She knows it was wrong. But being involved in drug distribution doesn't make you a murderer." The defense attorney's theory of the case was that Hollis had been at the mansion on April 12, 13, but not to commit murder. He claimed she'd gone there to confront Thatcher and Sutton about their threats to expose both the drug operation and her mother's affair with Whitmore, hoping to negotiate some kind of solution. "She brought the restored lacrosse stick as a genuine peace offering," Waverly argued, his voice earnest. "She wanted to apologize, to make amends, to find a way forward that wouldn't destroy both families. But when she arrived, she found the brothers already dead, murdered by someone else who had their own reasons to want them silenced." It was a bold strategy, essentially admitting Hollis's presence at the crime scene while blaming the murders on an unknown third party. Waverly promised to present evidence that the Calderwood-Moss pharmaceutical empire had enemies, competitors who'd benefit from the brothers' deaths and the destabilization of the company. He hinted at mob connections, at industrial espionage, at a shadowy figure who'd framed Hollis for crimes they'd committed. "The prosecution has physical evidence," he conceded. "But physical evidence can be planted, manipulated, misinterpreted. What they don't have is evidence that my client actually committed these murders, because she didn't. She was there, yes. She made poor choices, yes. But she is not a killer." The defense opening lasted only 45 minutes, significantly shorter than the prosecution's detailed presentation. Waverly was gambling that brevity would make his theory seem simpler and more believable, in contrast to the prosecution's complex web of evidence. He concluded by reminding the jury of their responsibility to presume innocence. "The prosecution has to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a high standard, the highest standard in our legal system, and when you examine their evidence carefully, when you look past the emotion and the theatrics, you'll find that reasonable doubt everywhere. My client is not guilty of murder. She deserves your careful consideration and your verdict of acquittal." The courtroom was packed for these opening statements with journalists from the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, and dozens of other outlets scribbling notes and typing frantically. The families sat on opposite sides of the gallery, Whitmore and Genevieve Calderwood-Moss, surrounded by supporters, Sterling and Caledonia Kensington Sullivan, isolated and alone. Hollis sat at the defense table in a conservative gray dress, her hair pulled back, her expression carefully neutral. The only sign of stress was her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, the faint scarring from her Haley disease visible even under makeup. As court adjourned for the day, the legal analysts gathered outside to dissect what they'd witnessed. The consensus was that Prosecutor Torres had delivered a devastating opening, laying out a case that seemed overwhelming in its scope and detail. The defense's alternative theory seemed implausible, a desperate attempt to create reasonable doubt where none existed. But trials were unpredictable, and Thomas Waverly was known for his ability to dismantle seemingly airtight cases through aggressive cross-examination and unexpected witnesses. The battle had begun, and the nation was watching. Detective Isabella Watson sat in the back row of the gallery, reviewing her notes and preparing for her testimony scheduled for the following week. She'd investigated this case methodically, building an evidence file that should be unassailable. But she knew that courtrooms were theaters where truth sometimes took a back seat to performance, where a skilled defense attorney could transform certainty into confusion. She'd watched it happen before, watched guilty people walk free because juries couldn't navigate the complexity of the evidence. That couldn't happen here. Thatcher and Sutton deserved better. Justice demanded better. The prosecution spent the first 2 weeks of trial building their foundational case, calling witness after witness to establish the timeline, the physical evidence, and the technical details of the smart home system. Dr. Sarah Martinez from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation spent 2 full days on the stand, walking the jury through the DNA evidence in language they could understand, explaining how the markers for Haley-Haley disease made the genetic identification as certain as a fingerprint. Thomas Waverly's cross-examination couldn't shake her conclusions, though he tried, to suggest the DNA could have been transferred innocently during one of Hollis's many visits to the mansion before the murders. Special Agent Marcus Chen from the FBI testified about the digital evidence, the encrypted messages, and the smart home logs. He brought blown-up printouts of the messages where Hollis discussed her paternity claim and the brothers' threats, reading them aloud in a flat, clinical voice that made their content seem even more chilling. They're threatening to challenge my paternity claim legally, to expose my mother's affair and destroy both families. I can't let that happen. I won't let that happen. The words hung in the courtroom air, prosecutors resting their case on the defendant's own written admission of motive. But the trial's pivotal moment came during the 3rd week, when prosecutor Violet Torres called her bombshell witness, Dr. Helena Strauss, a geneticist from the University of Colorado's Medical Center. Dr. Strauss had conducted independent DNA testing at the prosecution's request, analyzing samples from Hollis, Whitmore Calderwood Moss, Thatcher, Sutton, and Caledonia Kensington Sullivan. Her testimony would establish definitively whether Hollis's paternity claim was real or delusional, whether the motive the prosecution had outlined was based on fact or fantasy. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity for this testimony, reporters standing in the aisles, sketch artists working frantically to capture every detail. Dr. Strauss took the stand wearing a simple black suit, her credentials impeccable, her demeanor professional and unshakable. Violet Torres walked her through the testing methodology, establishing the scientific foundation before dropping the bombshell. Dr. Strauss, based on your analysis of the DNA samples provided, can you tell us whether Whitmore Calderwood Moss is the biological father of Hollis Kensington Sullivan? The courtroom went absolutely silent, every person leaning forward, everyone holding their breath, for the answer that would confirm or destroy the prosecution's motive theory. Yes, Dr. Strauss replied, her voice clear and certain. With a probability of paternity exceeding 99.997%, I can state conclusively that Whitmore Calderwood Moss is the biological father of Hollis Kensington Sullivan. Furthermore, my analysis confirms that Thatcher and Sutton Calderwood Moss were her half-brothers, sharing a father but having different mothers. The genetic markers are unambiguous and have been verified through multiple independent tests. The gallery erupted in gasps and murmurs, reporters sprinting from the courtroom to file updates, the sketch artists' hands flying across their pads. Genevieve Calderwood Moss made a sound like a wounded animal, her face going pale, her body swaying in her seat. Two of her supporters grabbed her arms to steady her, but she pushed them away and stood abruptly. For a moment it seemed she might speak, might scream, might do something dramatic. Instead, she simply collapsed, her legs giving out, her body crumpling as consciousness fled. The trial had to be suspended while paramedics rushed to her aid, the courtroom descending into chaos. Judge Martinez called a 30-minute recess, while Genevieve was treated and eventually transported to Aspen Valley Hospital for observation. When court resumed, the atmosphere was electric with tension, the revelation of Hollis's paternity having transformed the case from a crime story into a full-blown family scandal. Whitmore Calderwood Moss sat in the gallery, looking 20 years older than he had at the trial's start, his carefully maintained composure shattered. Caledonia Kensington Sullivan had her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed performative, even in their intensity. Prosecutor Torres continued Dr. Strauss's direct examination, establishing that the DNA testing definitively proved Hollis had been telling the truth about her biological connection to the Calderwood Moss family. This wasn't a delusion or a fantasy, Torres argued to the jury. This was reality. Hollis was Whitmore Calderwood Moss's daughter, which made her entitled to inherit a larger portion of the family fortune than her half-brothers. When Thatcher and Sutton threatened to legally challenge that claim, they weren't just threatening to expose a drug operation, they were threatening to take away her identity, her birthright, everything she believed she deserved. That's why she killed them. Thomas Waverley's cross-examination of Dr. Strauss was subdued, recognizing that he couldn't challenge the science without looking foolish. Instead, he tried to use the paternity revelation to support his alternative theory. Dr. Strauss, if Thatcher and Sutton were planning to legally challenge Hollis's paternity claim, that would create a motive for someone else to kill them as well, wouldn't it? Someone who had their own reasons to want the brothers silenced before they could expose the affair and destabilize both families. Dr. Strauss looked confused, clarifying that she was a geneticist, not a criminal profiler, and couldn't speak to motive beyond the scientific facts. The afternoon session brought more devastating testimony from Christine Volkoff, the forensic accountant who'd traced Hollis's embezzlement from the Calderwood Moss Pharmaceutical Trust. Volkoff presented detailed charts showing how Hollis had systematically stolen $18 million over 18 months, using the money to fund her fentanyl operation and to pay dealers who distributed drugs at elite prep schools across the country. The operation had been sophisticated enough to evade the trust's auditors, creating false invoices and shell companies that looked legitimate on paper but existed only to launder Hollis's criminal proceeds. The defendant created a company called Aspire Pharmaceutical Consulting, Volkoff testified, pointing to incorporation documents on the courtroom screens. It claimed to provide marketing services to Calderwood Moss Pharmaceuticals, billing $300,000 to $500,000 per month for work that was never actually performed. The money would flow into Aspire's accounts, then be transferred to other shell companies, then used to purchase fentanyl analogs from Chinese suppliers. By the time the money reached its final destination, it was completely untraceable through normal auditing procedures. The prosecution introduced evidence that Thatcher Calderwood Moss, working on a project for his Harvard Law class about corporate fraud in the pharmaceutical industry, had discovered the Aspire Pharmaceutical Consulting Scheme. His research notes, recovered from his laptop, showed he'd traced the shell companies and identified the pattern of fake invoices. His final entry, dated April 10, 2023, just 2 days before the murders, read, "Confronted H about Aspire, she admitted everything. Drug operation even bigger than the embezzlement." Says she'll stop if we keep quiet. But S wants to tell Father we're meeting with her tomorrow night to give her one last chance to confess voluntarily. That entry was the last thing Thatcher had written before his death, a record of his final interaction with the person who would kill him 36 hours later. Prosecutor Torres read it aloud to the jury twice, letting its implications sink in. Thatcher gave her a chance, Torres said, her voice heavy with emotion. He and Sutton were willing to let her confess voluntarily to try to get help, to avoid the public scandal that would destroy both families. And her response was to murder them both. The defense tried to argue that the laptop entry was ambiguous, that it didn't prove Hollis had actually shown up for the planned meeting or that she'd been the one to kill the brothers. But the smart home logs showed Hollis's access credentials being used at 11:03 p.m. on April 12th, exactly when she would have arrived for that one last chance meeting. The GPS data from her Mercedes G-Class showed the vehicle had been at the mansion from 10:58 p.m. on April 12th until 5:43 a.m. on April 13th, placing her at the scene during the window when the murders occurred. As the third week of trial concluded, the prosecution's case seemed overwhelming. They'd proven motive through the paternity DNA and the brothers' discovery of Hollis's crimes. They'd proven opportunity through the smart home logs and GPS data. They'd proven means through the DNA on the murder weapon and the work order showing Hollis had possessed that weapon immediately before the killings. The defense's alternative theory of an unknown third-party killer seemed increasingly desperate, a Hail Mary attempt to create doubt where the evidence pointed inexorably toward guilt. But Thomas Waverly had promised surprises during his opening statement, unexpected witnesses who would challenge the prosecution's narrative. As jury selection for Week 4 began, the defense filed notice that they would be calling Marisol Vargas, the family Owayaways pair who'd allegedly been paid $2 million to disappear to Argentina. Somehow, Waverly had tracked her down and convinced her to testify, and her video deposition would be played during the defense's case. The prosecution objected strenuously, arguing that testimony from someone who'd taken money to flee the country should be inadmissible. But Judge Martinez ruled that if the testimony could be properly authenticated, it would be allowed. The prosecution spent a frantic weekend preparing for this new development, unsure what Marisol Vargas might say or how it would impact their case. Violet Torres suspected a defense trap, worried that Vargas might claim she'd witnessed someone else at the mansion or that she'd been coerced by the real killers into keeping silent. The defense strategy was becoming clear. Sow doubt through any means necessary, even if it required flying in witnesses from South America and presenting theories that bordered on conspiracy. The trial was far from over, and the most dramatic testimony was still to come. The fourth week of trial opened with a procedural hearing outside the jury's presence, arguments about the admissibility of Marisol Vargas's video deposition. Prosecutor Violet Torres stood before Judge Martinez with barely contained fury, arguing that the defense was trying to introduce unreliable testimony from a witness who'd been paid millions to disappear and had every reason to lie. Your Honor, this woman took $2 million to flee the country and avoid cooperating with law enforcement. Now the defense wants to present her testimony as if it's credible evidence. This is exactly the kind of bought and paid for witness testimony that undermines the integrity of our justice system. Thomas Waverly countered that Marisol Vargas had been located through legitimate investigative means and had agreed to give her deposition voluntarily, with authentication provided by Interpol through a diplomatic cooperation agreement with Argentina. The prosecution is afraid of what Ms. Vargas will say, Waverly argued. They want to keep the jury from hearing eyewitness testimony that contradicts their narrative. But Ms. Vargas was in the mansion on the night of the murders. She saw things that are directly relevant to this case. The jury has a right to hear her account, and they're perfectly capable of assessing her credibility, given all the circumstances. Judge Martinez spent an hour reviewing the authentication documents, verifying that Interpol had indeed confirmed Marisol Vargas's identity and that she'd given her deposition under oath with proper legal advisors present. The judge ultimately ruled that the deposition could be played for the jury, but that the prosecution would be allowed to present extensive impeachment evidence about the $2 million payment and Vargas's flight from the country. The jury can decide how much weight to give this testimony, Martinez concluded, but they have a right to hear it. The deposition video was played on the courtroom's screens that afternoon, a grainy but clear recording showing Marisol Vargas sitting in a nondescript office in Buenos Aires. She was 43 years old, her face lined with stress, her hands fidgeting nervously throughout the testimony. She testified in Spanish with simultaneous English translation provided by a certified court interpreter. Her account of the night of April 12-13, 2023 was explosive, confirming some aspects of the prosecution's case while introducing new elements that created exactly the doubt Thomas Waverly needed. "I was staying in the guest house that night," Marisol testified, her voice barely above a whisper. "I usually don't stay over because I have my own apartment in town, but Mrs. Calderwood Moss had asked me to be there in case the boys needed anything. I was watching television around midnight when I heard raised voices from the main house. I looked out my window and saw lights on in the great room, saw figures moving around, but I couldn't tell who it was or what they were arguing about." The prosecution had anticipated this much. What came next was the part that would dominate news coverage and create chaos in the courtroom. Around 2:30 in the morning, I heard the front door of the main house open and close. I looked out again and saw someone running across the lawn toward the driveway. It was a young woman. I could tell by her build and the way she moved. She got into a dark SUV and drove away very fast, the tires spinning on the gravel. I went to the main house to check on the boys, and that's when I found them. Marisol's testimony about discovering the bodies matched the physical evidence, her description of the scene consistent with what investigators had found. But her claim that she'd seen someone fleeing at 2:30 a.m. contradicted the smart home data showing Hollis's Mercedes had remained at the property until 5:43 a.m. "Are you certain about the time?" the defense attorney conducting the deposition had asked. "Very certain," Marisol replied. "I looked at my phone to check because I was frightened. It was exactly 2:34 a.m. when I saw the person running to the SUV. Under questioning, Marisol admitted that she'd been approached by someone representing the Kensington Sullivan family shortly after the murders, offered $2 million in cash to leave the country and not speak to police. "I was terrified," she explained, tears streaming down her face. "I have family in Argentina, family who were being threatened if I didn't cooperate. They said if I talked to the police, my mother and my sister would be hurt. I took the money and I left. I'm ashamed of what I did, but I was afraid for my family's safety." The prosecution's cross-examination, conducted via video link by Violet Torres herself, was brutal. Torres systematically dismantled Marisol's credibility, pointing out inconsistencies in her timeline, questioning why she hadn't called 911 immediately upon finding the bodies if she was so innocent and afraid. "You took $2 million to run away and keep silent about a double murder," Torres said, her voice dripping with contempt. "And now you expect this jury to believe you're telling the truth when the defense pays you to come back and testify? How much are they paying you for this testimony, Ms. Vargas?" Marisol insisted she hadn't been paid anything beyond travel expenses for the deposition, that she'd come forward because her conscience had been torturing her. But Torres presented bank records showing a $500,000 wire transfer from a Kensington Sullivan family account to Marisol's Argentine bank just 1 week before the deposition. "That's not payment for testimony," Thomas Waverly objected loudly. "That's compensation for lost wages and the emotional distress of being forced into hiding." The objection was overruled, Judge Martinez allowing the jury to see the evidence and draw their own conclusions. The most damaging moment in the cross-examination came when Torres confronted Marisol with the GPS data from Hollis's Mercedes, showing the vehicle had remained at the mansion until 5:43 a.m. "You claim you saw someone fleeing in a dark SUV at 2:34 a.m., Torres said, pulling up the GPS logs on the screens. But the defendant's vehicle, the only dark SUV registered to either family that was in the area that night, didn't leave until 3 hours later. So either you're mistaken about the time, or you're lying about seeing someone flee, or there was another vehicle you forgot to mention. Which is it?" Marisol looked confused, stammering that she knew what she'd seen, that maybe there had been more than one vehicle, that perhaps the GPS data was wrong. Her credibility was shredding in real time. The jury, watching as a witness who had been paid millions to disappear, now struggled to keep her story coherent under prosecutorial scrutiny. By the time the video deposition ended, even defense attorney Thomas Waverly looked concerned, realizing that his surprise witness had created as many problems as she'd solved. But Waverly had one more trick up his sleeve, a second witness who'd been subpoenaed under protest and who would provide testimony that directly implicated Caledonia Kensington Sullivan in the cover-up. Dr. Marcus Reynolds, a digital security consultant who'd been hired by the Kensington Sullivan family 3 days after the murders, took the stand on the afternoon of the 4th week. Reynolds testified that Caledonia had asked him to help her clean up some security issues with the smart home system at the Calderwood Moss mansion, specifically to delete certain access logs and camera footage. "I told her I couldn't do that," Reynolds testified, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "I explained that deleting evidence related to a criminal investigation would be illegal and could result in serious charges for both of us." She became very upset, said I didn't understand how important this was, that her daughter's entire future was at stake. "She offered me $100,000 to just make the problem go away. I refused and left." I reported the conversation to the FBI the next day. The prosecution had known about Reynolds's report, but had held it in reserve, waiting to see if the defense opened the door to evidence about Caledonia's involvement. Now Waverly had done exactly that by calling Marisol Vargas, whose testimony about being paid to flee directly implicated the Kensington Sullivan family in witness tampering. Violet Torres immediately moved to introduce additional evidence about Caledonia's attempts to obstruct justice, and Judge Martinez granted the motion over Waverly's strenuous objections. The evidence showed that Caledonia had indeed manipulated the smart home access codes, deleting what she could from the security system's main server. But she'd failed to realize that the geothermal system kept independent logs that weren't connected to the main network, and those logs had preserved the evidence that would ultimately convict her daughter. Torres presented testimony from the smart home system's manufacturer, showing exactly which files had been deleted, and when, all corresponding to Caledonia's login credentials in the 3 days after the murders. "This isn't just about covering up a crime," Torres argued to the jury. "This is about a mother so consumed by protecting her daughter's privileged position that she was willing to destroy evidence, bribe witnesses, and obstruct a double murder investigation. Caledonia Kensington Sullivan knew her daughter was guilty. That's why she took these desperate measures. That's why she paid Marisol Vargas $2 million to disappear. That's why she tried to hire Dr. Reynolds to delete the digital evidence. Every action she took confirms that her daughter is the killer." The prosecution called additional witnesses to establish Caledonia's involvement, including her personal attorney who testified under immunity that Caledonia had asked him about the legal risks of destroying evidence and whether deleted digital files could be recovered by forensic investigators. The attorney, clearly uncomfortable with having to testify against his former client, explained that he'd advised Caledonia not to do anything that could be construed as obstruction of justice. "She thanked me for my advice," he testified quietly. "Then She fired me and hired someone else. As the fourth week of trial concluded, the focus had shifted dramatically from whether Hollis was guilty to whether her mother would also face charges for her role in the cover-up. Prosecutor Torres filed a motion to have Caledonia Kensington Sullivan arrested immediately for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to tamper with witnesses, and destruction of evidence. Judge Martinez set a hearing for the following Monday, allowing the trial to continue while considering whether to take the extraordinary step of arresting the defendant's mother in the middle of the proceedings. The weekend between weeks 4 and 5 saw frantic legal maneuvering on all sides. Caledonia hired a separate criminal defense team to represent her in the pending obstruction charges. Sterling Kensington Sullivan, who'd remained largely silent throughout the trial, filed for legal separation from his wife, distancing himself from her actions. Whitmore Calderwood Moss released a statement through his attorney expressing his profound grief and betrayal over the revelations about his affair and its tragic consequences. The case had become a spectacle of family dysfunction, a display of how wealth and privilege had corrupted multiple generations into moral bankruptcy. Through all of this, Hollis sat in court each day with the same carefully composed expression, showing no visible reaction to the revelations about her mother's crimes or the mounting evidence against herself. But jail staff reported that her nighttime behavior was changing, that she'd been heard crying in her cell, that she'd torn up photographs of her family that had been hanging on her wall. The mask was beginning to crack, the psychological pressure of the trial finally penetrating the armor of sociopathic calm she'd maintained for months. The final weeks of testimony would determine not just her fate, but the fate of everyone in her family who'd chosen loyalty over justice. The fifth week of trial began with the catastrophic decision to call Caledonia Kensington Sullivan as a defense witness. Thomas Waverly had agonized over this choice, knowing that putting Hollis's mother on the stand was extraordinarily risky given the pending obstruction charges. But he believed that only Caledonia could humanize Hollis for the jury, could explain the dysfunction and manipulation that had shaped her daughter's development. It was a gamble that would backfire spectacularly, providing the prosecution with its most damaging testimony yet, and ultimately resulting in Caledonia's arrest in the courtroom itself. Caledonia took the stand on Monday morning wearing an expensive black Chanel suit, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, despite the stress lines visible around her eyes. She'd lost weight during the trial, her collarbones prominent, her hands shaking slightly as she placed them on the witness stand rail. Prosecutor Violet Torres watched her carefully, already preparing the cross-examination that would destroy whatever sympathy Waverly hoped to create. The gallery was packed beyond capacity for this testimony, with standing room only and journalists crowding the aisles. Thomas Waverly began gently, asking Caledonia to describe Hollis's childhood, to explain the pressures of growing up in extreme wealth and the emotional distance that had characterized her relationship with Sterling. Caledonia testified that Hollis had always been sensitive, desperate for approval and affection that Sterling had been too busy to provide. "My husband built his private equity empire by working 80 hours a week," Caledonia said, her voice carefully modulated. "Hollis barely saw him. She grew up with nannies and tutors and au pairs, but never with a father who actually noticed her. She started acting out in her early teens, shoplifting, drinking, looking for any kind of attention. The testimony was meant to paint Hollis as a victim of neglect, a troubled child who'd never received proper guidance. But Waverly made a critical error by asking Caledonia about the affair with Whitmore Calderwood Moss, trying to establish that Hollis's identity crisis had been created by circumstances beyond her control. "When did you tell Hollis that Whitmore was her biological father?" Waverly asked. Caledonia's face went pale, and she glanced at the prosecution table where Torres was already rising to object. "Your Honor, "I need to advise the witness that she has the right to remain silent," Torres said formally. Any testimony about her knowledge of the paternity issue and when she shared it with her daughter could implicate her in conspiracy to commit murder. I strongly recommend the witness consult with her attorney before answering. Judge Martinez agreed, calling a recess while Caledonia huddled with her newly retained legal team. When court resumed 30 minutes later, Caledonia announced that she would answer all questions truthfully against her attorney's advice. "I told Hollis about her biological father on February 12, 2023, Caledonia testified, her voice barely audible. She'd done a DNA test on her own, gotten curious about her ancestry after one of those genetic testing kits became popular with her friends. When the results came back suggesting she had family connections she didn't know about, she confronted me. I had to tell her the truth. Whitmore and I had been having an affair for 18 years. It started when our families first became close, when Sterling and Whitmore were working on a major pharmaceutical deal together. We were both unhappy in our marriages, both feeling trapped by the expectations of our social position." The admission created a stir in the gallery, journalists typing frantically, sketch artists capturing Caledonia's anguished expression. Waverly tried to redirect the testimony back to Hollis's emotional state, but Caledonia had opened a door that couldn't be closed. "How did Hollis react to learning about her paternity?" Waverly asked, probably hoping for testimony about confusion and trauma. Instead, Caledonia described a daughter who'd been thrilled by the revelation, who'd seen it as an opportunity rather than a crisis. "She was excited," Caledonia admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "She said it explained everything, why she'd always felt different in our family, why Sterling had never really connected with her. She started researching inheritance law immediately, learning about the Calderwood-Moss family trust and how it was structured. She realized that, as Whitmore's only daughter, she'd be entitled to a larger share than the sons. She became obsessed with the idea of claiming her rightful place in the Calderwood-Moss dynasty. This was not the testimony Waverly had wanted. He tried to minimize the damage, asking about Hollis's mental health and whether she'd received proper psychological treatment, but Caledonia kept making things worse, describing how she'd helped Hollis strategize about revealing her paternity to Whitmore and the boys, how they'd planned to use the information to secure her position in the family. "I thought it was just fantasy," Caledonia said desperately. "I never imagined she'd actually hurt anyone. I just wanted her to feel valued, to have the identity and family connection she'd been denied her whole life." When Violet Torres stood up for cross-examination, the courtroom went silent with anticipation. Torres walked slowly toward the witness stand, carrying a thick folder of evidence that she placed deliberately on the rail in front of Caledonia. "Ms. Kensington Sullivan, you've testified that you told your daughter about her biological father on February 12, 2023. Is that correct?" Caledonia nodded. "And on February 15th, just 3 days later, you transferred $500,000 from your personal account to your daughter's account. What was that transfer for?" Caledonia's eyes widened, clearly not expecting Torres to have that specific financial information. I was helping her with some expenses. She'd told me she needed money for school." Torres pulled up bank records on the courtroom screens. These records show that $400,000 of that money was immediately transferred to a shell company called Aspire Pharmaceutical Consulting, the same company your daughter was using to embezzle money from the Calderwood-Moss Pharmaceutical Trust. You funded her criminal enterprise, didn't you? "I didn't know what she was doing with the money," Caledonia insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. Torres pulled more evidence from her folder, showing text messages between mother and daughter discussing the pharmaceutical project and expanding distribution. The messages were coded but clear enough to suggest Caledonia had at least suspected what Hollis was involved in. "You knew your daughter was running a drug operation Torres stated flatly. You knew she was embezzling millions from the Calderwood Moss family, and when the brothers discovered what she was doing, you knew they had to be silenced. No, Caledonia shouted, her composure finally breaking. I never wanted anyone to get hurt. I was just trying to protect my daughter. But Torres was relentless, presenting evidence that Caledonia had met with Hollis on April 11th, the day before the murders, for 3 hours at a private location. What did you discuss during that meeting? Torres demanded. Caledonia's attorney objected, but Judge Martinez overruled, ordering the witness to answer. We talked about what would happen if the brothers told Whitmore about everything, Caledonia admitted, tears streaming down her face. Hollis was panicked. She said Thatcher and Sutton were going to expose the drug operation and challenge her paternity claim in court. She said they were going to destroy everything we'd worked for, that they'd make sure she got nothing from the Calderwood Moss estate. I told her to just confess, to try to work something out, but she said it was too late for that. Torres leaned forward, her voice sharp. And then what happened? What did you do to help your daughter solve this problem? Caledonia's face went white, realizing she'd walked into a trap. I gave her my access codes to the smart home system at the Calderwood Moss mansion. I thought she was just going to talk to the brothers, to try one more time to reason with them. I didn't know she was planning to kill them. I swear I didn't know. The courtroom erupted in chaos, reporters rushing for the doors, the gallery buzzing with shocked conversation. Judge Martinez had to bang his gavel repeatedly to restore order. You gave your daughter the access codes? Torres pressed, her voice rising. The same codes that were used to disable the security cameras and adjust the temperature to preserve the crime scene? You helped her prepare for murder, and then you tried to cover it up afterward by deleting evidence and paying witnesses to flee the country? I was trying to protect my child, Caledonia screamed, standing up from the witness stand. What mother wouldn't try to protect her child? Yes, I deleted what I could from the security system. Yes, I paid Marisol to leave. Yes, I tried to make the evidence go away, but I didn't know she was going to kill them. I didn't know until it was too late. And then what was I supposed to do? Turn in my own daughter? The confession was complete, captured on camera, witnessed by the jury and the entire packed courtroom. Thomas Waverly was on his feet objecting, trying to get his client to invoke her Fifth Amendment rights, but Caledonia was past the point of strategic thinking. She'd started confessing and couldn't stop, the words pouring out in a torrent of guilt and justification. Torres let her talk, let her hang herself with her own admissions, each word creating more evidence for the obstruction of justice charges that were about to be filed. Judge Martinez called an immediate recess, ordering U.S. Marshals to take Caledonia into custody pending formal charges. The arrest happened right there in the courtroom, deputies approaching the witness stand and reading Caledonia her rights, while the jury watched in stunned silence. Hollis sat at the defense table with no expression at all, watching her mother being handcuffed and led away. Their eyes met for just a moment, and later jury members would report that Hollis's face showed something that might have been satisfaction, as if watching her mother take the fall for her crimes was exactly what she'd planned all along. The afternoon session was canceled while the prosecution prepared formal charges against Caledonia, and the defense team regrouped from the catastrophic testimony. By 5 p.m., Caledonia Kensington Sullivan had been formally charged with conspiracy to commit obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, and accessory after the fact to murder. Her bail was set at $5 million, which Sterling paid immediately despite their pending separation, apparently unable to completely abandon his wife, even after her courtroom confession. The media coverage that evening was wall-to-wall, every network leading with footage of Caledonia's arrest, legal analysts debating whether her testimony had definitively proven Hollis's guilt. The consensus was that a mother doesn't delete evidence and pay witnesses to flee unless she knows her daughter is guilty. Thomas Waverly gave a brief statement outside the courthouse, arguing that Caledonia's mental state had been compromised by grief and stress, that her testimony should be viewed skeptically. But the damage was done, irreversible, catastrophic. Detective Isabella Watson watched the news coverage from her office, feeling a grim satisfaction that justice was finally catching up with the entire Kensington Sullivan family. She'd known from the first day of her investigation that this case involved more than just one killer, that the whole family structure was rotten with secrets and lies. Now those secrets were being exposed in the most public way possible, 2 generations of corruption and privilege collapsing under the weight of their own moral bankruptcy. The trial was entering its final phase, and the verdict seemed increasingly inevitable. The 6th week of trial brought additional evidence that the prosecution had held in reserve, waiting for the right moment to deploy it for maximum impact. Violet Torres had saved some of her most damaging material for rebuttal, and she began by calling FBI Special Agent Rebecca Morrison, who had been investigating Hollis's prescription drug operation while the murder trial proceeded. Agent Morrison testified that federal agents had intercepted coded letters being sent from Hollis's jail cell to an address in Denver, letters that appeared to contain instructions for continuing the fentanyl distribution operation even while she was incarcerated. The letters had been written in a simple substitution cipher that the FBI's cryptography unit had cracked within hours. They contained detailed instructions about supply chain management, dealer territories, and pricing strategies for various fentanyl analogs and prescription pills. The defendant was literally running her criminal enterprise from jail, Agent Morrison testified, presenting blown-up copies of the decoded letters on the courtroom screens. She was using a shell company called Stratosphere Consulting as a front, routing orders through a series of intermediaries to maintain plausible deniability. The operation continued to generate approximately $300,000 per week even after her arrest. This revelation undermined any defense claim that Hollis was a troubled teenager who'd made mistakes and felt genuine remorse. Torres walked the jury through the timeline, showing that Hollis had begun sending the coded letters within 2 weeks of her arrest, using her access to the jail's mail system to maintain control of her operation. The letters showed sophisticated business planning, discussion of market expansion into new territories, and calculations of profit margins that demonstrated a deep understanding of criminal enterprise management. "Does this seem like someone who's sorry for her crimes?" Torres asked rhetorically, "or someone who's simply sorry she got caught?" The most damaging letter had been sent on July 15, 2023, approximately 3 months after the murders and 2 months before trial began. In it, Hollis had written to her unknown associate, "The trial is proceeding as expected. My mother's testimony will create sympathy, and Waverly believes we can secure acquittal on the murder charges, even if I have to plead to some drug offenses. The key is maintaining the alternative suspect theory and keeping the focus on Caledonia's mistakes rather than my own actions. Once I'm free, we can expand operations into the Midwest and potentially double our revenue. The short-term inconvenience of incarceration will be worth it for the long-term gains." The letter revealed a staggering level of calculation, suggesting that Hollis had viewed her mother's testimony as a strategic tool rather than a personal betrayal. Torres argued that Hollis had actually planned for Caledonia to take some of the blame, sacrificing her mother's freedom to improve her own chances of acquittal. "This defendant is a sociopath in the truest sense of that word," Torres told the jury. "She feels no genuine attachment to anyone, not her victims, not her family, not anyone. Everyone is simply a piece to be moved around on a chessboard to advance her own interests. That's why she could murder 2 young men she'd known her entire life. That's why she could watch her mother be arrested without showing any emotion. She's incapable of normal human empathy." The prosecution then introduced evidence about the Weimaraner, the family dog whose GPS tracking data had been mentioned briefly in earlier testimony. Dr. Angela Rodriguez, a veterinary forensic specialist, testified about the dog's microchip records showing it had been deliberately moved from its usual location to a locked guest wing on the night of the murders. The dog was fed, given water, and secured in a comfortable room, Dr. Rodriguez explained. This wasn't cruel treatment of an animal. This was someone making sure the dog wouldn't interfere with their plans, wouldn't alert anyone to what was happening, and wouldn't be traumatized by witnessing violence. The care shown to the dog, contrasted with the brutal murder of two human beings, created a chilling portrait of Hollis's psychology. She could show consideration for a pet while beating two men to death with a lacrosse stick, compartmentalizing violence in a way that suggested deep psychological dysfunction. Torres presented expert testimony from Dr. Richard Chen, the forensic psychologist who had evaluated Hollis, describing her as exhibiting classic traits of narcissistic personality disorder with antisocial features, grandiosity, lack of empathy, manipulation of others, and a sense of entitlement that justified any action in pursuit of her goals. Ms. Kensington Sullivan genuinely believes she deserved the Calderwood Moss inheritance more than the legitimate sons, Dr. Chen testified. She'd constructed an entire identity around being Whitmore's biological daughter, seeing it as her rightful place in a dynasty that had been denied to her. When Thatcher and Sutton threatened that identity by planning to legally challenge her paternity claim, she didn't see them as human beings with their own rights and futures. She saw them as obstacles to be removed, problems to be solved through whatever means necessary. The defense tried to counter with their own psychological expert, Dr. Elizabeth Hartman, who testified during the transfer hearing. Dr. Hartman maintained that Hollis suffered from dependent personality disorder and had been manipulated by older criminals into participating in the drug operation. But on cross-examination, Torres demolished this theory by presenting the coded letters showing Hollis had been the one giving orders, managing the operation, and making strategic business decisions. Does someone with dependent personality disorder create and manage a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise? Torres asked. Dr. Hartman had to concede that the letters suggested a different psychological profile than her initial evaluation had indicated. The most dramatic moment of Week 6 came when Torres introduced evidence of a second paternity test that Hollis had commissioned secretly in March 2023. This one testing whether she was actually Whitmore's daughter or whether the February DNA results had been somehow manipulated. The second test, conducted by a different laboratory, had come back with the same 99.97% probability of paternity, conclusively establishing that Hollis's claim was legitimate. But what made the evidence significant was what Hollis had done with the results. She'd sent copies to Thatcher and Sutton, along with a letter demanding they acknowledge her as their half-sister and support her claim to the family inheritance. The letter, dated March 18, 2023, was introduced as evidence and read aloud to the jury. Dear Thatcher and Sutton, I'm attaching proof that I am your half-sister, your father's biological daughter. I'm sure this comes as a shock, but it's the truth that our families have been hiding for my entire life. As Whitmore's only daughter, I'm entitled to a full share of the Calderwood Moss estate, potentially more than either of you under the terms of the family trust. I'm asking you to support me in claiming what's rightfully mine, to help me take my place in the family I've always belonged to. If you refuse, I'll have no choice but to pursue my rights through legal channels, which will expose the affair and create a scandal that will destroy both our families. I hope you'll choose to do the right thing and welcome me as your sister. Thatcher's response, found in his email records, had been brief and cutting. This is blackmail, and we won't be party to it. If you're really our father's daughter, we'll deal with that reality as a family, with appropriate legal and financial counseling. But threatening to create a scandal unless we give you what you want is extortion. And the more we learn about your other activities, the embezzlement, the drug operation, the more convinced we are that you're not fit to be part of this family regardless of biology. We're giving you 48 hours to stop your criminal activities and come clean to our father. After that, we're going to the authorities. That email had been sent on April 10, 2023, exactly 48 hours before Hollis had picked up the restored lacrosse stick from the antiques conservator. The timeline was damning, showing a direct causal link between the brothers' ultimatum and Hollis's acquisition of the murder weapon. Torres presented the evidence methodically, walking the jury through each date, each action, each decision that led inexorably to the murders on April 12, 13. This wasn't a crime of passion, Torres argued. This was a calculated execution of two people who stood between the defendant and what she believed was her destiny. The prosecution rested its case on Friday of Week 6, having presented overwhelming evidence of premeditation, motive, and opportunity. Thomas Waverly immediately moved for acquittal, arguing that the prosecution hadn't proven beyond reasonable doubt that Hollis had actually committed the murders rather than being present at a crime scene created by someone else. Judge Martinez denied the motion, finding that a reasonable jury could certainly conclude guilt based on the evidence presented. The defense would have 1 week to present its case, to try to create doubt where the prosecution had built what seemed like an impenetrable wall of proof. Waverly called only 3 witnesses, recognizing that his best strategy was to keep the defense case short and avoid giving the prosecution more opportunities to introduce damaging evidence. He presented 2 alibi witnesses who claimed to have seen Hollis at a different location on the night of the murders. But Torres demolished both on cross-examination by showing they were employees of Sterling Kensington Sullivan, who had financial motives to lie. The third and final defense witness was a forensic expert who testified that the DNA evidence could have been transferred innocently through casual contact, but he had to admit under cross-examination that the specific pattern of DNA deposition was most consistent with the weapon being used during violent impact. The defense rested on Wednesday of Week 7, and both sides prepared for closing arguments. The trial had lasted nearly 2 months, producing thousands of pages of testimony and hundreds of exhibits. The jury had heard from 47 witnesses, viewed hours of video evidence, and seen forensic analysis of everything from DNA to digital records to dog GPS data. Now it would all come down to the final arguments, to each side's ability to synthesize the evidence into a coherent narrative that would determine whether Hollis Kensington Sullivan spent the rest of her life in prison. Closing arguments began on Thursday, September 28, 2023, with prosecutor Violet Torres delivering what legal analysts would later describe as one of the most powerful summations in Colorado legal history. She stood before the jury for nearly 3 hours, methodically walking through every piece of evidence, connecting each strand into an unbreakable web of proof that left no room for reasonable doubt. She began with the smart home data, the house that testified, showing how the geothermal system's logs created an irrefutable timeline of Hollis's preparation for murder and her presence at the scene during the critical hours. Torres used the courtroom's video screens to create a synchronized presentation showing the smart home logs alongside GPS data from Hollis's Mercedes, text messages between Hollis and the victims, and the coded letters she'd sent from jail. Every piece of evidence tells the same story, Torres argued, her voice resonant with conviction. The defendant planned these murders carefully, acquired the weapon specifically for this purpose, manipulated the smart home system to eliminate evidence, and then tried to continue her criminal enterprise from jail while her mother destroyed evidence and paid witnesses to disappear. This is not a wrongful accusation. This is not a case of reasonable doubt. This is the clearest, most documented case of premeditated murder you will ever see. She spent significant time on the DNA evidence, explaining once again how the Haley disease markers made identification as certain as a fingerprint. The defendant's own genetic disorder convicted her, Torres said. Her own body left evidence on the murder weapon that cannot be explained away as innocent transfer or contamination. The skin cells were embedded in the victim's blood and tissue, deposited during the violent act of beating two men to death. There is no other explanation that fits the scientific evidence. Torres addressed the defense's alternative theory directly, mocking the idea that some unknown third party had framed Hollis by using her access codes, her vehicle, her DNA, and her motive. The defense wants you to believe that someone else committed these murders and then went to extraordinary lengths to frame a 17-year-old girl. Who? Why? How did they obtain her DNA? How they get her access codes to the smart home system? How did they know about her drug operation and her paternity claim? The defense offers no answers because there are no answers. Their theory is fantasy, desperation, an attempt to create doubt where none rationally exists. The prosecutor's most emotional moment came when she spoke directly about Thatcher and Sutton Calderwood Moss, showing the jury photographs of the victims in life. Thatcher, in his Harvard Law graduation gown, Sutton rowing with his Olympic training team. These were not just victims, Torres said, her voice thick with controlled grief. These were brilliant young men with bright futures, men who were trying to do the right thing by giving the defendant one last chance to confess and get help. Their reward for that mercy was to be beaten to death in their own home by someone they'd trusted their entire lives. They deserved better. They deserved justice. And you can give them that justice with your verdict. Thomas Waverly's closing argument, delivered on Friday morning, lasted just 90 minutes and focused entirely on creating doubt about the timing of the murders and the reliability of the smart home data. He argued that the technology could have been manipulated, that GPS data wasn't always accurate, that the DNA could have been transferred innocently during one of Hollis's many prior visits to the mansion. The prosecution has built a case on circumstantial evidence and technological data that requires you to trust machines over human judgment, Waverly argued. But machines can be wrong. Machines can be manipulated. We've shown you that Caledonia Kensington Sullivan had access to those systems and tried to delete evidence. How do we know she didn't manipulate the logs to frame her own daughter, to protect herself from responsibility? It was a desperate theory, and Waverly's own body language suggested he didn't believe it himself. But he pushed forward, arguing that the prosecution hadn't definitively proven Hollis had committed the murders as opposed to being present at a scene where someone else had committed the crime. Presence at a crime scene is not proof of guilt, he told the jury. The prosecution wants you to assume that because my client was there, because she had motive, because she had the opportunity, that she must have done it. But assumptions are not proof. Assumptions are not evidence beyond reasonable doubt. The closing argument fell flat, legal analysts noting that Waverly seemed defeated, going through the motions rather than mounting a passionate defense. The evidence was simply too overwhelming, the defense too weak, the alternative theories too implausible. When Waverly sat down, the courtroom felt the deflation of a lost cause. A defense attorney who'd fought hard, but knew he'd been defeated by the facts. Judge Martinez's jury instructions consumed the entire afternoon on Friday, carefully explaining the legal standards for first-degree murder, the definition of reasonable doubt, and the requirements for finding guilt on each of the 27 counts Hollis faced. The jury was instructed that they could consider the defendant's age and background, but must apply the same standards of proof regardless of her privileged status. They were told to evaluate each piece of evidence independently and in combination, to consider witness credibility, and to deliberate carefully before reaching a verdict. The jury began deliberations on Monday, October 2nd, 2023. and the courthouse immediately filled with media and spectators waiting for a verdict. The conventional wisdom was that deliberations would be quick given the strength of the evidence, but the jury surprised everyone by requesting to review specific testimony and evidence repeatedly. They asked to see the smart home logs again to rehear Dr. Sarah Martinez's testimony about the DNA evidence, to review the coded letters from jail. Judge Martinez granted each request, sending the exhibits back to the jury room and allowing court reporters to read back the requested testimony. By Wednesday afternoon, after nearly 30 hours of deliberation, the jury sent a note to the judge indicating they'd reached a verdict on most counts but were deadlocked on one charge related to the drug operation. Judge Martinez gave them an Allen charge, encouraging them to continue deliberating to reach a unanimous verdict if possible. 2 hours later, another note arrived. We have reached a unanimous verdict on all counts. The courtroom filled immediately, Hollis being brought from the holding cell, the families taking their places in the gallery, the media crushing into every available space. The jury filed in at 4:47 p.m. on October 4, 2023, their faces solemn, several members visibly emotional. The foreman, a 52-year-old accountant named Michael Torres, no relation to the prosecutor, stood when Judge Martinez asked if they'd reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor." The clerk accepted the verdict forms and handed them to the judge, who reviewed them silently before passing them back to be read aloud. In the matter of Colorado v. Hollis Kensington Sullivan on the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Thatcher Calderwood Moss, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. A gasp ran through the courtroom, Genevieve Calderwood Moss sobbing openly in the gallery. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Sutton Calderwood Moss, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. Hollis sat completely still, her face showing no reaction whatsoever, maintaining the same eerie composure she'd displayed throughout the trial. The clerk continued through all 27 counts, guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder, guilty on 14 counts of drug trafficking, guilty on 8 counts of embezzlement, guilty on 3 counts of money laundering. On every single charge, the verdict was the same: guilty, guilty, guilty. By the time the clerk finished reading, several jury members were crying, the weight of their decision visibly affecting them despite the clarity of the evidence. They'd just convicted a teenager of crimes that would send her to prison for the rest of her life. Judge Martinez set sentencing for November 15, 2023, giving the defense time to prepare mitigation evidence and the prosecution time to prepare victim impact statements. The judge remanded Hollis to custody pending sentencing, and deputies moved to escort her from the courtroom. For just a moment, as she stood to leave, Hollis looked at her parents in the gallery. Sterling was openly weeping, his face buried in his hands. Caledonia, out on bail pending her own trial, sat frozen, her expression unreadable. Hollis's face finally showed something resembling emotion, but it wasn't grief or remorse. It was contempt, a look of pure disdain for the weakness she saw in her parents' tears. The sentencing hearing on November 15th, 2023, was the final act in the tragedy, the moment when the consequences became real and permanent. Prosecutor Violet Torres called 4 victim impact witnesses, starting with Genevieve Calderwood Moss, who testified about the loss of her 2 sons and the destruction of her family through lies and betrayal. "I lost my children to violence," Genevieve said, her voice breaking. "But I also lost my husband, my marriage, my faith in everything I thought I knew about my life." Hollis Kensington Sullivan didn't just kill Thatcher and Sutton. She killed our entire family, destroyed decades of love and trust with her greed and her entitlement. Whitmore Calderwood Moss testified next, his statement brief but devastating. "I made terrible mistakes in my personal life, mistakes that created the circumstances for this tragedy, but nothing I did justified what happened to my sons. They were innocent in all of this, caught in the middle of adult failures and teenage sociopathy." I will spend the rest of my life trying to understand how I helped create the conditions that led to their deaths. He sat down without looking at Hollis, unable to even acknowledge the daughter whose existence had cost him everything he valued. The sentencing guidelines for 2 counts of first-degree murder in Colorado required life imprisonment without possibility of parole, and the additional convictions for financial crimes carried a combined sentence of 40 years. But because Hollis had been tried under the Corinthian Protocol as an adult, Judge Martinez had discretion in how the sentences would be structured. The defense pleaded for the possibility of eventual parole review after 25 years, arguing that Hollis's age at the time of the crimes should be considered a mitigating factor even in adult court. Torres argued forcefully against any possibility of parole, presenting evidence of the coded letters from jail and Hollis's complete lack of remorse. This defendant has shown no genuine rehabilitation, no understanding of the harm she's caused, no capacity for change. She belongs in prison for the rest of her natural life, and the victims' families deserve the certainty that she will never walk free. The prosecutor requested that the sentences run consecutively rather than concurrently, ensuring that even if some legal technicality ever reduced the murder convictions, the financial crimes would keep Hollis incarcerated. Before imposing sentence, Judge Martinez asked if the defendant wished to make a statement. Thomas Waverly advised against it, but Hollis insisted, standing to address the court in what would become one of the most chilling moments in Colorado legal history. She spoke for less than 60 seconds, her voice calm and measured, showing the same sociopathic detachment that had characterized her behavior throughout the trial. I want to say that I understand the court's position and the jury's verdict. I made decisions that had consequences, and I accept responsibility for those decisions. Sometimes in life, you have to clean up loose ends to move forward. That's what I was trying to do. I'm sorry it worked out this way for everyone involved. The phrase, clean up loose ends, spoken so casually about murdering 2 human beings, caused an audible gasp in the courtroom. Before Hollis could say anything more, deputies moved toward Caledonia Kensington Sullivan in the gallery, producing an arrest warrant that had been issued that morning. Caledonia Kensington Sullivan, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder based on evidence presented during your daughter's trial. The arrest happened at the defense table while the sentencing hearing continued, Caledonia being handcuffed and led away screaming that it wasn't fair, that she'd only been trying to protect her child. Judge Martinez waited for order to be restored before delivering the sentence. Hollis Kensington Sullivan, you have been convicted by a jury of your peers of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 25 additional felony counts. The evidence presented at trial showed a level of premeditation, manipulation, and callous disregard for human life that is almost unprecedented in this court's experience. Your statement today, referring to the murders of 2 innocent young men as cleaning up loose ends, confirms that you lack the basic human empathy necessary for rehabilitation. This court sentences you to life imprisonment without possibility of parole on each murder count, to be served consecutively, plus an additional 40 years for the financial crimes. You will spend the rest of your life in the Colorado Department of Corrections, and you will never be eligible for release. The sentence was the harshest possible under Colorado law, life without parole plus 40 years, ensuring that Hollis would die in prison regardless of any future legal developments. Deputies moved to escort her from the courtroom for the final time, and as they led her past the gallery, she looked once more at her parents. Sterling had his head in his hands, broken and destroyed. The spot where Caledonia had been sitting was empty, her own arrest having already begun her journey to prison for her role in the cover-up. Hollis's expression showed nothing, no sadness, no regret, no recognition of the devastation she'd caused. She was already planning her next move, already thinking about appeals and legal strategies, incapable of accepting that this was truly the end. The aftermath of the trial saw additional legal proceedings cascade through the Colorado courts. Caledonia Kensington Sullivan was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder based primarily on her courtroom confession, sentenced to 25 years in prison. Sterling Kensington Sullivan was never charged, having cooperated fully with investigators and having no knowledge of the murders or the cover-up. He sold the family compound and donated much of his fortune to victims' rights organizations, trying to atone for the evil his family had created. Whitmore and Genevieve Calderwood Moss divorced within 6 months of the trial's conclusion, their marriage unable to survive the revelations of infidelity and the loss of their sons. The case became a cultural touchstone, a story that resonated far beyond the courtroom in Aspen, Colorado. It raised questions about wealth and privilege, about the criminal justice system's treatment of wealthy defendants, about the psychology of teenage killers, and the families that created them. Books were written, documentaries were produced. Law school professors taught classes analyzing the legal strategies and the novel use of smart home technology as evidence. The Corinthian Protocol, the law that had allowed Hollis to be tried as an adult, survived multiple constitutional challenges and was adopted by 3 other states. Detective Isabella Watson retired from law enforcement 2 years after the trial, having spent 20 years bringing killers to justice, but feeling that this case represented the pinnacle of her career. She'd solved a murder using technology that hadn't existed when she'd first joined the force, proving that meticulous investigation and forensic science could overcome even the most sophisticated criminal planning. The case file on Hollis Kensington Sullivan sat in her office as a reminder that wealth and privilege could buy many things, but not escape from the consequences of murder. Hollis Kensington Sullivan is currently incarcerated at the Colorado Women's Correctional Facility, where she will remain for the rest of her natural life. Prison officials report that she's a model inmate, quiet and compliant, spending her time reading economics textbooks and filing endless appeals that have no realistic chance of success. She maintains her innocence in conversations with other inmates, claiming she was framed by her mother and betrayed by a corrupt legal system. But the evidence doesn't lie, and the House testified against her, and justice, however delayed, ultimately caught up with a teenage killer who believed her wealth made her untouchable. The mansion where Thatcher and Sutton died was sold by the Calderwood Moss estate for $12 million to a tech entrepreneur who demolished it and built something new on the land, unable to live in a place where such violence had occurred. The antique lacrosse stick, the murder weapon, remains in an evidence locker, cataloged and preserved in case of appeal. The $50,000 Patek Philippe watches were returned to the Calderwood Moss estate and eventually donated to a museum as historical artifacts from one of Colorado's most infamous murder cases. And somewhere in the mountains above Aspen, the geothermal system that recorded a killer's planning continues to regulate temperature and preserve comfort for a new family, its digital memory of murder long since archived and stored as evidence that technology, in the end, serves justice better than it serves crime.